Казахстане общий пайплайн составляет свыше 1200 проектов ГЧП. За 20 лет совокупная стоимость проектов ГЧП Казахстана выросла с 67 миллиардов тенге до 3 триллионов 650 миллиардов тенге. Ключевые отрасли – образование, здравоохранение, энергетика и ЖКХ. Знаковые проекты ГЧП в Казахстане. В России реализуется более 4600 проектов ГЧП с общей стоимостью 7,9 триллионов рублей, из которых 72% частные инвестиции. Знаковые проекты ГЧП России. Растет интерес к ГЧП в Кыргызстане. Проектный портфель превышает 90 проектов ГЧП с совокупным объемом частных вложений свыше 450 миллиардов сомов. Знаковые проекты ГЧП в Кыргызстане. Малые проекты ГЧП составляют 57% портфеля проектов, при этом вклад малого и среднего бизнеса в ВВП Кыргызстана 51,7%. Узбекистан демонстрирует впечатляющий рост с 6,2 миллиарда долларов в 2021 до 34 миллиардов долларов в 2025 году. Крупнейшие по объему финансирования проекты ГЧП сосредоточены в энергетическом, медицинском и транспортном секторах. Однако для раскрытия инвестиционного потенциала Евразии важны не количество объявленных проектов, а зрелые рынки ГЧП. Евразийский банк развития стоял у истоков государственно-частного партнерства в странах-участницах. Сейчас банк действует в поддержку зрелости рынков. Мы знаем, где скрыты резервы эффективности ГЧП и приводим их в действие. И мы делаем это вместе.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, просьба поприветствовать спикеров сессии.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the speakers of this session. Mr. Aydos Kabetov, Deputy Director of the Kazakhstani Center for PPP. Avak Avanesyan, Deputy Minister of Finance of the Republic of Armenia. Nurbek Anarbekin, the Director of the PPP Center. The moderator of the panel session is Svetlana Maslova, Project Director, PPP Project Director of EDB. Good morning. Indeed, we have so many joint PPP initiatives, and we even prepared a joint presentation, and this is not our first panel discussion. And thank you so much for agreeing to discuss PPP-related issues with us. Let's take a look at the numbers now. The portfolios and their dynamics, I think, are quite, as we say, good-looking. They look good, and we can feel optimistic looking at them and confident. But if we step away from standard indicators of our portfolios, then we'll see a slightly different picture. In accordance with the report of the audit chamber, 1.3 trillion tenge is the amount for which we have 2.3 million tenge of obligations. And in Kazakhstan, the PPP law went through 4 rounds before it was finally approved and adopted. In the Russian Federation, the PPP portfolio is the largest. But let's take a look at the judicial practice. The number of disputes is also quite high. In Uzbekistan, in accordance with the PPP development program, until 2030, the objective is to increase the number of PPP projects in various sectors. Only in education, not less than 100 schools and 100 kindergartens should be built under this program. But there is a limit for new agreements in this country. In 2025, it was $6.5 billion. In The April report of the International Monetary Fund, it was recommended that this limit should be decreased and lowered. This is not something that we should be concerned about, but this is a signal, which means that the growth of the PPP portfolio itself maybe doesn't matter. It's not important, and maybe we don't even need that growth without strengthening the maturity of the PPP environment, because its strength reflects the preparedness of investors and bankers to invest private capital into this. And also, this depends on the ability of governments to create national regulatory frameworks for PPP. So domestic PPP market should be strengthened first. You see here a number of PPP barriers and obstacles. This is the result of the review that was conducted by the bank. Basically, we conducted a survey in various countries, member states and non-member states. All of them, I mean, more detailed information about this you will find on one of the stands outside. So these barriers, they can be applied to all of our member states. Some of them have sort of country-specific features, and there are certain things that we need to consider. For example, population in some countries don't have access to guarantees, benefits. And then some people think that you can prepare a great PPP agreement sort of from scratch. And all of us, we do know that that's not so. That is not the truth.
Top 5 factors that are limiting PPP development is a lack of long-term liquidity, both in SOMs, in tenge, in SUMs, because the local banks, they give short and cheap loans, so project financing mechanisms are working poorly. That means to attract the credit in the loan in national currency into PPP is very difficult. Poor contract management after financial closure, because many are celebrating the result when the agreement is signed and thinking that the work has ended, but it just started, and there are no mechanisms to provide for that. It's poor pre-project preparation, limitation of state guarantees. So we've chosen the rapid round discussions where we would ask our distinguished speakers to share their opinion in the format of fast answers, live reactions, one case, one conclusion. I would request Aidos you to start as representing the host country of Kazakhstan. What is limiting PPP in Kazakhstan? Actually, I can subscribe to all these top 5 factors that are limiting PPP. At the same time, I'd like to also pinpoint one more, is the state sector comparator. It's a value for money analysis. Why I want to emphasize this factor, because in Kazakhstan, paradoxically, the analysis which should have selected PPP is the main bottleneck. Why is it so? Because mostly at the screening stage, the investment proposal stage, the analytics and analysis of those projects is done by the civil servants. And due to lack of competence, lack of experience, they are choosing whatever is more clear for them, the mechanisms that are more clear to them. And when they compare the options, they wouldn't select PPP. and the comparison is done unfairly. So if they take from the PPP the entire life cycle of costs, investment and maintenance costs, for the state procurement, they would only take the construction costs. We were fighting with this for a long time, and now we started to have a more scrupulous approach to this issue. But another element of this comparison are risks, and we've seen the problem that if in PPP we see that these risks are given to the private area, then in case of the budget investment projects, these risks remain with the government, and we don't have the data retrospective. There are no data in Kazakhstan on those projects becoming more expensive. In 2014, when we were structuring Bakat project, there was a very good statistics on how the roads become more expensive in the world when it's done by the traditional method. And in the world, the statistics shows that the projects become 40% more expensive compared to PPP. So with the support of IFC consultants, we started to do analytics in the road industry. And the data has shown that in Kazakhstan, this number is equal to 70%, 70. And so using this data, we can show that PPP is much more efficient if we have to compare this right. So answering your question, value for money analysis, I believe, is the main limiting factor right now in Kazakhstan. We're going to come back to this in the discussion, because value for money is a key tool that everybody is trying to follow. And we see that currently in Kazakhstan that brings some difficulties. Avag, what about Armenia? What do you see as a limiting factor? I believe we are going to talk about the same, more or less, because in our countries, as we have discussed with colleagues, we have similar problems. So it looks like you have the legislative base, you have the methodology, but projects are being slowed down. The problem is that in the market, the competence of civil servants is quite low. So if we see how to make a bankable project, we discussed this one with one of the ministries about the road, and we said, let's make a toll road or availability payment. And they said, no, it's a cool road, it's so good, but functionally, from economic benefits, what would you get? But just look at the size of the asphalt. So when budgeting and implementation is input-based, when you have spent the budget money and you get this amount of asphalt, this thickness, and you forget about this, whether you use this road or not, how many times do you have to repair it, it doesn't matter. But in PPP, you always ask these questions in advance. And here I have this feeling like PPP needs longer preparation and it takes more time, whereas this time is a requirement to find certain knowledge in order to get this value for money. So there are some international organizations which determine value for money only through public comparator, but in Armenia we have a small problem. We had an aggressive privatization in 1990s and the 2000s. So critical infrastructure projects were done through concession and arrangements which look like PPP. And sometimes we don't have a public sector comparator because we don't have a state airport since early 2000s. So that is why we need to look at the risks, we need to look at the bankability, and we need to invest money and time in project preparation. This is not time wasted compared to PPP or the traditional ways. So this time has to be spent. You need to force the government to go through this process. Because when they go through this process once, the other processes are much more clear. They go faster. So we need to make sure that bankable projects could be cleared to private sector as well as to government. Nurbek, how could you add this picture as PPP is becoming more dull? The colleagues have raised some specific questions. We see these issues in practice. In Kyrgyzstan, I would name two factors that we are facing. First is financial constraint, is that commercial banks cannot issue loans in big amounts and at the interest rate which the private partner would like to take. And PPP projects, we understand that it's a long-term project for at least 15, 40 years, and commercial banks are not ready to support this because they have a different policy. They need to earn money at a higher rate. So that's why we're trying to talk to the national banks to issue for the PPP projects using this is one of the critical factors. And second, as you know, our portfolio is having 100 projects. So to sign a project, to sign an agreement, to prepare a project, to prepare a feasibility study, it's one thing. But the PPP does not have this scope to analyze and follow up further control so that the project could be scrutinized and follow the stages that are written in the generation. Because there are projects when the agreement has been signed, when we have agreed for certain terms, and after some time, the project itself starts falling down because there is no monitoring and no. These are the factors that are slowing down PPP projects. In Rebecca, I'm experiencing the same problems. I believe that you can manage the. I am just trying to balance whether there will be still interest left to PPP, to public balance. And it's nice that we have PPP. These are the factors that transfer PPP potential to a mechanism into sizable projects. Results of our polling, they are almost all obvious. What has surprised me pleasantly that the experts are thinking about constant monitoring of projects to account the mistakes and integrate lessons in the new practice, in the next iterations. So let's go back to the top 5. It's budget support, and if it does not replace the private investment, the early entrance into the bank, I support digitalization. Aidos, what is your position? Do you coincide with any of the top factors here? What is moving PPP in Kazakhstan? Yes, I agree completely, especially these two mentioned here. They have one thing. So based on my experience and experience of our center, it's important to know predictability. So in PPP world, there should be no vagueness. The investor is investing for 15, 20 years. They should see their horizon clearly. So what are the level playing game in field rules? and how they are planning to support these projects with their priorities. So participation of IDB and having the pipeline for us is an important factor. The factor which moves PPP, which propels PPP around. Kazakhstan went a bit further. Since last year, we had a plan of projects of special importance. We have attached International Financial Institute to each. So the cost is $4 billion, those projects in total. 4 or 5 are attached to the ADB, such as projects in health, in Karaganda. They're having the second stage of competition. They are being scrutinized. And Simin October, where we're also preparing investment proposal. The transboundary project, which applies to Yaba mandate. The 5th project is the university dormitory in Almaty. So as to university dormitories, it's a unique situation where the ADB, to be part of the project, has made the program PPP in Kazakhstan. So forming the government support measures to stimulate foreign investors to access these projects. IFC is in charge of the Mangistau potable water plant. We are also having a trip to Aktau. So the technicians have made analytics of other we need to sort out the demand here. Number 7 is EBRD in Almaty, in the university clinic. It's a long ago project. It's almost 9 to 10 years, but it was according to the new PPP law. We hope to see there a project which would be interesting for us all and would reply to EDB mandate, because we are long-standing partners, so we'd like to see EDB partners in the structuring of such projects. I hope that this would happen soon. Armenia has a smaller portfolio, so perhaps for you, the drivers are even more important than for other countries. What do you think, how the influence of this positive dynamic may affect you? If we look at the other law of 2019, our project is to have 7% of the VVP. Here, in the modern world, what is propelling PPP? In the year 2000, there was just access to a certain minister, just to agree to make this project well. Now it's the predictability. Predictability should be clearly written in the legislative acts. That's how our law was concentrated, because concentration with the investors was always coming back and forth. What are the guarantees? Are we protected? Are we going to be in a prison? And what if we... So that's why we've created the law, so that investors would know that they are protected if the project works as it should work. So it's important to write this law rightly, because if you give too much pressure, then you would have a huge fiscal gap and there will be no social positive effect from this spending. So I believe that in the nearest future, it will be nice to institutional framework for investors. The rest depends on the economy because it depends on the international financial institutions, IFIs, that are predictable because they talk to the investors in the language that they know. So if these are the local banks on their funding, there is a risk that so if we are the
And so those, they're kind of used to working with the government. So for them, it's easier to put a little bit of pressure on the government than for a local bank. So they're also part of this predictability environment. We're hearing applause from the from the conference room next to us. But let's talk about the following. Nurbek, how come you've been able to increase your portfolio so quickly? And will you be able to ensure that this growth in Kyrgyzstan is actually sustainable going forward? You see, the Kyrgyzstan PPP sort of framework was set up back in 2019, and in 2019 the center just began its work. Then in 2020 we had the pandemic, and by 2023 the center had only 3 projects for the amount of $4 million. That was the result of 3-year work results, so to speak. But after that, we saw that the number of projects that we had started sort of to increase. But for PPP, I think the most important thing is government support. If we have government support, development banks, financial institutes, I'm sure will also start supporting PPP. As you know, we have a large number of large-scale projects that are supported by financial institutes, by development banks. Just to give you an example, in the Narin region, we are building a solar power plant with the support of one of the development banks. With ADB, there is also in the Chusky region a power plant project supported by, as I have said, ADB. So I don't want. I just want to point out that with EDB we have a large number of projects. The Almaty-Kemin Isikul Road project is one of them. The second one is our methodological workshop project, which has proven to be very successful, especially in the regions. In the Talaskaya region, this project has been implemented. When I started working at the center, there we didn't have a single project, but with the help of EDB, we conducted workshops in that region. And also we have this sort of awareness-raising work whereby we educate people, we tell people about PPP. And also in the Talaska region, we have a project which is which value is at several millions of soms. So having spoken to my colleagues, I do see that in the regions we need to come up with a sort of a template agreement, because when you are located in the capital, physically you're not able to implement all these projects throughout the country. And we need to educate local authorities about PPP and to provide them with these template agreements for them to be able to work. And we also need to explain to them how PPP works, what's the mechanism, and then people will be able to register these agreements then themselves. I agree and I cannot argue with you. And we've gone through all of these points on my slide, and I think the picture looks a little bit more optimistic now. But I have a question for you, which is quite a difficult question, and it's about budgetary obligation limits. And here, new agreements during the current period cannot be concluded. So here you have data broken down by country. So Aidos, what's your opinion? Does this drive the growth or slows it down? I think these limits actually drive the growth, because when investors invest for 5, 10, 15 years, they have this question: will the government, the state, comply with its or fulfill its obligations? And so the answer to that question is actually these limits, because with these limits, the government says to investors that it's ready to take on all these obligations and that it will fulfill them. And I would like to say that we looked at UK and their practices, and they had this PPI contract boom in the past. And in 2018, they conducted an audit which sort of put an end to the conclusion of new PPP contracts. So this matter should be treated seriously, and the methodology here matters. It shouldn't be. We shouldn't be just having random numbers here. We are also looking at Uzbekistan, and at this forum already we've said that they do have this infrastructure contract boom right now in the country. In 2019 in Uzbekistan, colleagues just began their work on PPP, and so for the past 6 or 7 years, they have increased the number of contracts by 5 or 6 times. So basically, they have 5 or 6 times more contracts than Kazakhstan, and they have only 6 or 7 years of experience. So these limits, they do drive PPP, and this is not an obligation, this is a guarantee. Thank you. As for Uzbekistan, I urge everyone to take a look at the International Monetary Fund report on Uzbekistan. They're actually raising all these issues there. In the Russian Federation, these limits were introduced recently, and the market reacted negatively to them. But since you treat them as a guarantee, you think that they should be treated and perceived as a guarantee. I think this should be something we need to take into account. And my colleague, I agree with him, but let's look at Portugal. Portugal also has a large amount of obligations, and back in the 80s, in the 90s, with the support of IMF, they started negotiations on all of their PPPs, and everything will go well over a period of 5 or 10 years, maybe even 15. But then, without the support of the government, you won't be able to do anything. There will be risks, and so the government needs to tell everyone what it will do, because without that, it's difficult to enter into agreements. As my colleague has said, in the long run, yes, the government said yes, but then the next cycle, I mean, in 20 years' time, are you sure that your political cycle will remain the same as it is right now? And so we cannot say whether this is a predatory contract or whether there are too many obligations. And so such limits tell us that calculations were made, the government took an informed decision on how to balance all these risks. Without that, it will be difficult to work. Also, to calculate is important, and private investors and the government will be reading these contracts more carefully and more closely. 3% of conditional obligations. We're talking about XR 19. When we show fiscal risks in our fiscal reports, we also show termination payments. And under XL 19, they are not calculated. This is a little bit too technical, but this needs to be communicated to everyone, because under IPSAS, control over situation should not be full. If you're terminating something unilaterally without any obligations, you are saying everything is great, services are there, work is being done, and you decide to terminate a contract. And so this is exactly what we're talking about in our fiscal reports. So these determinant payments, we show them, and because it's important for foreign investors. But when we talk about obligations, these are the obligations that should not be controlled in full. Right, control and guarantees, these are important things. In the Kyrgyz Republic, there is no sort of control, so to speak, Nurbek. So now, having listened to our colleagues, why is it not established? Are you going to establish it? And if you're going to establish it, which approach will you adopt? In Kazakhstan, we have this tenge number. In Armenia, we have this ratio, GDP ratio. Which one will work better for you? You're right, saying that there is no limit in Kyrgyzstan, and in the law that was adopted in 2011 to increase the portfolio, that was done. But at this stage for Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan doesn't need limits, but very, very soon these limits will have to be introduced, because this is something that needs to be done, because if we sign agreements for large amounts, we need to make sure that we know what obligations the government has and what obligations the private partner has. So if we look at our colleagues' practices, definitely we'll look into them. Each country has its own sort of specific features, and everything sort of should be individualized, so to speak. But at this stage, for PPP in Kyrgyzstan, there's no need for any limits. But over time, I think we will introduce them. Well, you're right. For developing markets and for those markets that are starting to grow, perhaps these limits or this limit will be a barrier, will be an obstacle. And so we will get back to this. And then you're right that if your portfolio is growing, maybe you don't need limits. To answer Nurbek's question, we will be happy to share our knowledge with you and our experience with you, and we'll be happy to tell you about those negative things that we have experienced, because working with these limits, we have been doing that for the past 10 years, so we have many years experience. In Kazakhstan, as I have said, I mean, there should be a methodology. And Nurim Izbaevich actually is here with us, but he was the one who initiated these limits and who had them approved. And the approach is very straightforward. Each region, and now, by the way, we have this Republican budget law, which approves a budget for each region, which is tied into their profit income that they generate. So 20% of income of each region is sort of the ceiling for this limit. And I would like to make one more point and comment, rather. I would like to comment on what my colleague has just said. One of the most serious topics is contingent obligations. Unfortunately, in Kazakhstan, these limits are tied to direct obligations, and contingent obligations are not covered. But last year, relevant laws were adopted, and right now we're actually working on this issue, and until the end of this year, we would like to approve and adopt these rules, not just for the limits for these contingent liabilities or obligations, but also for monitoring. So my next question for you about PPP institutes and regulatory framework. One PPP project can be sort of launched without all these things. Maybe even a couple of them can be launched. But obviously you won't be able to sustain sort of, you won't be able to have more than the two. And also here we have projects that attract a larger number of private investors. And so we looked at, together with our experts, at what works and what doesn't work. So as institutional mechanisms, the PPP center should be the nucleus of the whole environment, of the whole system. But the majority of the experts said that the PPP center under the Ministry of Finance will be a better instrument. Actually, I didn't expect that. On our panel, we have two representatives from the PPP centers that are not part of the Ministry of Finance of their countries, and they are doing a great job. And also we have someone from the Ministry of Finance who are just setting up such a center, accounting for or recording obligations, web portal, funds, preparation of projects. In Uzbekistan, by the way, this is a legally sort of binding sort of obligation. Regulatory framework, a special legal regime for PPP projects. Yes, we have that. It's reflected in all of the legislation of all of the countries. Value for money, and we're coming back to what you said, Aidos. Again, it's a question. I mean, the question is as follows: what assessment, how they assess it, etc., methodology guidelines, etc. This is about what you said. But here we have another sort of proviso: protection from regulatory risks, immunity of the government in PPP project disputes, or refusal from this immunity. I would like to start with the Armenian legislation. It has fantastic provisions and it can be used as an example. And in any disputes arising out of PPP projects, the PPP agreements, the direct financial agreements with creditors and other transactions, the public partner doesn't have the right to use or take advantage of its immunity. For investors, especially foreign investors, from the point of view of possible dispute settlement in an arbitral tribunal, etc., etc. So this is a great protection measure for them, and this will attract foreign private investors to the country. Aybek, let's start with you. I'm not going to say good things about your legislation, given your personal contribution to the development of this legislation, but I will just go through those provisions that need to be part of a working mechanism. Qualification criteria for competition participants. This is the first time I'm seeing such a good wording. Institutional mechanism for PPP projects. This is the only jurisdiction whereby the creation of working groups, project teams for competitions, for monitoring, for assessment, and we have a detailed sort of job description for everyone and a very wide range of guarantees available for partners and investors. But what works and what doesn't work here?
This is a double-edged sword. When you give strong guarantees, to whom to give this guarantee for what project, it becomes a lengthy process. If the guarantees are weak, then you can always exit the project, like in Amazon. And in Armenia, this is a single-sided door, one-side door. And the small level of competence leads to that the project is being stopped, because we already had a project which went through all the approvals, and when we've compared why it worked there and in other places it was stopped, it depends on the competence of a specific agency. And that means that to have a extreme concentration, it is not working. So why people prefer PPP to be in medicine? Because Ministry of Finance is always answering no. So if the people think that Ministry of Finance is okay, and then PPP is approved, but first you need to agree with the PPP center, and then with the Ministry of Finance, and so there are so many stages of the project implementation. So what works is this system in cases when the project is on the implementation stage. It means that it's an international company which comes and which adapts to our investment environment. What does not work is that this system is very difficult to prepare the pilot. So the person may not know the ropes, not know the ways. So you need to train this person. So it would be interesting to hear the experience of colleagues from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, how they have made sure that the people may work with all these documents locally, because the fear that I may press something and everything would collapse leads to the people not accessing PPP, even although investors are coming to you and asking for a project to be done through PPP. But we have a very odd situation. Regulatory situation is quite complex, where the government does not want to intervene with this. So the EDB should prepare the managers that could work through the project. So PPP is in a fog, and I've also recorded your metaphor on the fighter jets. I know everything about your mechanisms. They have written so much, the experts. What's your opinion? I'd like to note here 3 elements of PPP institution, based on my experience as to what the PPP center should be more efficient. I'm inclined to what kind of authorities this institution has. In our example, we are within the National Economy Ministry, and we're responsible for all projects, all finance, all state projects, not only PPP, but all state investment level projects. The implementation of based on the assessment of implementation, based on practice and not theory, we give recommendations to the government to change the legislation. So our legislation, according to the last assessment of ADB and World Bank, it corresponds to UNCITRAL. We're not going to change it based on the current challenges. So the first element is having the PPP centers, because this organization is the key in this system, which understands the logic of the government and the language of the investors and the requirements of the banks. So based on these stakeholders, it should know how to coordinate. So this is one of the key areas, because I've discussed before that we have a new pipeline of PPP projects. Coordination is given to the Kazakhstani PPP center. So the difference is that we do not do expertise of these projects at the final, because we were saying yes or no for the next stage. Now we participate on at the beginning stage, while selecting the pipeline, the projects, and the selecting consultants, its technical assistance. So that's our approach of the PPP center. The second element in the PPP institution is to have a clear digital platform. In Kazakhstan, it's called a PPP web portal, where the main thing is the information system of PPP, where all the process of planning are happening, including the competition procedures. So here I'd like to mention the role of EDB, because thanks to IDB, we had this system which is separately functioning, which has a lot of functions inside. Now we see that from the last year we have cancelled paper document flow, and so the only right language now is a digital language according to the bidding procedures. And the third area, as it was mentioned by Mr. Avag, are the competences. So the competence here is of those employees that are structuring the PPP projects. In order to get the live project, not only to bring this to commercial fruition, but also to close the finances and to have this project successfully being implemented. So since last year, we launched accreditation of the market participants to structure such projects. And the mandatory requirement is to have the international specialist on EPMG. So in Kazakhstan, these are the approaches now. And these are the mechanisms that are working right. Two laws on PPP and concession. There are two laws on PPP and concessions. They were united, and they were working, but mostly they were duplicating each other, and that was causing misunderstanding from the investors, including foreign investors, because they were always asking, what's the difference? There was no difference. It was just the planning process and some support measures. The concept, according to 2026, is oriented on several infrastructure projects. So back in 2018, we've signed BACAD. So there are 5 projects within this law. And this law on PPP is much wider, has different types of activities. In 2023, BACAD was launched, and earlier than the planned by 1.5 years, and is successfully functioning. So we need to strengthen these two laws. And the concession now is one of the types of PPP. So the PPP is applied to them, but also this is the so talking about investment return, and this is talking about paying to the users. Nurbeck. So a lot has been shown to us, as to the Kyrgyz Republic, by the eyes through of interpreters. So what is working here? Maybe there are no working tools on this slide at that moment. First of all, I would talk about the special economic mood of implementing PPP projects. This is just to test new innovation pilot decisions in PPP, which allows us to implement projects on a large scale, such as nationwide projects, to improve the infrastructure of the country for large mega projects. In Sandbox we have signed more than 8 agreements. For example, the first planned toll road in Uzgen in Osh Oblast. The agreement was signed on the 22nd of November 2024 using the Cabinet of Ministers. So in 11 months this project was implemented, and as far as you know, in Kyrgyzstan we have introduced the emergency for energy use, and that allows us in this regime of the project Sandstone to implement projects in renewables, in water. There are also innovative projects such as marking fuel. Also about the toll road for the eastern ring road along the Bishkek. This is a special project when the decision is made by the government and taking the private partner. The National Agency for Investment is coordinating our politics. It prepares the project documentation, brings this to the... And the Prime Minister is sealing this with his decree. Thank you so much. Now we have a general transition to the next question about best practices. And that's it allows us to be the part of national agency of PPP, and we hope to so the transfer of best practices, you have identified even 2. This is program PPP project with special importance with the participation of Astana Financial Institution. And what would you share to, and what kind of experience we need to adopt here in Kazakhstan? As to the program PPP, the experience of cooperation with ADB when we were restructuring the dormitory. So in order the auditor understand what is PPP, these are the industry rules for a specific. In 2016, in Kazakhstan, according to the research, 80% of all canteens, they require to be additionally equipped or fully equipped just to make hot dishes. And in our in one of the cities in Petropavlovsk, one of the investors have offered those who is in charge of a school in several school canteen in several schools. He said that I'm going to equip those canteens with necessary technique and machine if you give me the contract for 5 years. And at that moment, the agreements they were signed on an annual basis.
And so we have analyzed everything, and we discussed this on the PPP platform. And so we thought that if we do launch this mechanism, then we would be able to find partners. And so the relevant rules were changed in 2017, and now we have more than 400 PPP agreements that focus on canteens at schools. And this actually was recognized by the UN as the best PPP practice and example to be followed by the countries. And in what other areas and sectors can you work under this framework, PPP framework? Well, anywhere, in any sector. We conduct research studies, actually, and we help sectoral state agencies to adopt such rules. For schools, we prepared these rules. For gasification, also, such rules were developed, basically, under which gas was supplied to various communities. Also, street lighting. Basically, you can use this in any sector, in any area where you can sort of scale, so to speak, these projects. And that can be done, that can be spread, so to speak. So when you have ready-made sort of solutions which were tested and tried and which proved effective and which proved scalable, you can do that. You can use them, right, in any sector, yes. Also, during audits in 2019, we had this audit of all PPP agreements by the chamber, and then this question was asked: why all these projects are structured differently in different regions, and their value is different, and agreements were concluded with the same parties. And so based on that experience, we decided to focus on this program PPP. The pipeline, I've already talked about that. I will just say that there is one more sort of focus area, the PPP Academy. It's a sort of training, learning, or platform for learning. It was set up in 2012. Every year, dozens of government officials undergo training. Why government officials? I talked about accreditation previously, about international standards, but here the Academy focuses on improving government officials' skills and knowledge so that they're able to talk to potential investors properly, because it's terrible when government officials do not understand the structure of these projects, and that may lead to ineffective transactions using public funds, or, which is even worse, to these agreements being slowed down. And so such government official, without the proper understanding of the structure of PPP agreements will just make everything worse. So this is one of our best practices, which we will be happy to share with everyone. I mean, the PPP Academy. I would like to emphasize the contribution of EDB, actually. 175 representatives underwent training at the Academy last year, out of whom 65 was actually paid for by EDB. And over 6 months of this year, 40 people already underwent training with the support of EDB, for which we're very grateful to the bank. Thank you so much. Actually, we do this work, similar sort of. We do this work in Kyrgyzstan. We could open the academy under your center. But from you, everyone wants also to learn about smaller projects. What's the legal regime? What are the practices? And what does this give you? Smaller projects, every country has them. Each country has them. But you are the only country that legislatively, legally, has sort of adopted a special approach to such projects. Yes, our legislation stipulates or envisages the simplified regime for small projects, which value is up to 100 million som. We do understand that PPP is not just an investment instrument, but it's also an instrument that can be used to create jobs, especially in the regions. In the regions, small projects are viable, and small projects have proven effective and efficient. They have simplified procedures, and in the regions, as you can see, large projects whose value is 50 to 70 million som. That's their value, and that's why we decided to introduce small projects into the legislation. This helps to implement projects at the local self-governing level, so to speak. In Bishkek and Osh, we know they need infrastructure projects, but the regions, being at their own budgetary level, as we say, that enables us to implement smaller scale projects, and in the regions, and small scale projects are relevant. And if I'm not mistaken, on the list of implemented projects, the portfolio actually has more than 20 small scale projects. They do help to satisfy local infrastructure-related needs, and those are not projects that large foreign investors are interested in. Yes, these projects are for domestic, local investors. For example, resort projects, commercial projects, things like that. Agricultural, I think, yes, including agriculture. Abak, do you think that practices that the neighboring countries have can be attractive for you? Yes, definitely we can borrow certain practices from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. The number of projects shows to us that something is being done the right way. But I have a feeling that everything boils down to digitalization of processes and institutional preparedness. I would really like to take a closer look at these two aspects, because we need to know what the World Bank is doing. But when we look at high-quality European projects or high-quality projects in our countries, those two sets of projects are different from each other. And projects in our countries, they look somewhat similar. Perhaps we could use digital methods that could help government officials to implement these projects, and that could help investors to get a better understanding of such projects. And I think this can be something we could ask EDB to do. Can we sort of create a pool of sorts, including risk matrix, bankability, financial projects, standardization of terms, especially with the development of all these technologies. Perhaps we could look at our countries and at what they will end up having. I'm very grateful to the colleagues for this experience, because this experience will help us going forward to understand practically what worked, what didn't. But from Armenia's standpoint, we could look at settlement mechanisms, so to speak, and you've mentioned those. Quite often we think that our projects will be implemented successfully, but that's not always the case. Some things go wrong. Sometimes that doesn't mean that your project was bad or that you didn't prepare for it properly, but any project can fail. Risks are always there, and so we need to be prepared for failures. Both the government needs to do that and the private sector. So any project, even if it's a foolproof project, can lead to wrong expectations, and it means that we made a mistake when sort of selecting good projects. And so a good project is a project when we know what to do when things go wrong, right? Thank you very much. About digitalization, I understand your point. And since the bank is the expertise center in the region, it is prepared to help with scaling of these practices. But what we have prepared for our audience is the following. So let's move on to the insight round. I need each speaker to provide us with 3 life hacks, one tip of advice sort of for investors, one mistake and one trend. Okay, I'll do my best. For investors, I think the main recommendation is when selecting projects, they need to look at risk distribution, but not at guarantees that are provided by the government. Because if all risks are sort of on the government, then despite any guarantees, these projects will be doomed. So every risk needs to be managed by someone who does it best. Politically, regulatory risks should be managed by the government. Operational and construction building risks should be managed by the private partner. As for mistakes that the market makes, those projects that do not have any benefits for the public shouldn't be allowed, so to speak. We did have such projects in Kazakhstan, and so all these projects failed, despite the fact that agreements were concluded and they were structured. So when a project focuses on only profit, so to speak, for the private partner, or only for using up budgetary funds, such projects usually do not survive, so to speak. And so that's the main mistake that the market makes. As for market trends, I think in Kazakhstan there is this one trend. And incidentally, our center will be 18 years old, and the concessions law also will be about 20 years old. So from personal to the common, so to speak, that's what we need to do. Previously, projects were selected. Only those projects that were supported by important people, they were selected. People who had their reputation, etc., etc. Nevertheless, we, by amending the legislation, we're sort of moving away from this approach, and we're focusing more on the following. The legislation needs to create a system whereby PPP could be developed properly. And what we have been talking with Svetlana, these things need to be done. Limits, digital platform, all these trends that we've talked about. So everything put together, I think, will create a system. And Kazakhstan continuously is moving towards that goal, so to speak. Thank you, Aidos. For investors, two things. Number one, the idea for a project is not a project. And quite often investors come and say, let's build a road here. And then they say, this is my idea. I told you, I shared this idea with you. But it's not a project because proper projects require preparation. And it's important that you go through all these competition procedures because you generate an idea, the private sector generates that, and then they think that they would do all the work. But then at the end, it turns out that the project is not very viable, it's not of good quality, and nothing actually happened. And people say PPP doesn't work. But when we see things like when a large private company says, no, we want to go through this competition procedure, we need legitimacy, and the speed sort of increases, and such projects turn out to be very viable. If you take Armenia's example, any project that went through all these competition procedures, even if there were complaints from the public, etc., it will still be viable and stable. But those projects who didn't go through these procedures, for those, the government needs such projects can fail, actually. And so mistakes that are made by the government, by private people, so these are the mistakes. PPP is more effective. Why? Because risks are with the private sector. And so if people say all risks should be borne by the government, this is not PPP. This will take more time and the project will fail. So we need to have a clear understanding of what we offer, what we want from the private sector, and what we will get in exchange, so to speak. And as for the public sector, one recommendation. At the beginning you said, Svetlana, and it's very important, that the fact of an agreement being concluded or when a winner is announced, especially if it's in Armenia, this doesn't mean that this is victory. You say, we concluded an agreement with this large company, this is a victory. But then they come to you and say, let's start renegotiations. And you will not come back to them and say, we concluded an agreement, this is our victory, and here they are leaving. So your position is weak. So no victories should be announced until implementation is complete. The private sector are incredibly effective. They can save the country, the private sector, but they can also be a problem if they work with an incompetent agency. But that's the right thing to do for the private sector. And as for the trend, I think this transition from manual management, so to speak, I don't think I will be sharing anything new with you, to institutional development, standardization of contracts, of practices, and then more focus on contract management. Previously, PPP internationally was a new thing, and everyone was focusing on tenders, on preparation, on all other things. And everybody was ignoring management. No, that shouldn't be the case. I think management is the most critical element of PPP, and consulting companies and companies who will support governments in implementation and control over contracts, I think going forward will be the ones who will get this access to a very interesting market. Nurbek, can you share your life hacks with us? I agree with my colleagues. I think we are similar, but I would like to share my view with you, which may be slightly different from your view. Recommendation for investors. Whenever they come with their ideas to us, I always say, do not spend more on research. You need to go to international funds, to international banks, in order to see whether your project will be viable, because sometimes they come to us with ideas that really surprise me. I mean, are you sure your project is viable? So you do need to prepare a feasibility study and analyze everything, and after that you should move on to implementing your project. I think that's my main sort of recommendation for investors. As for mistakes by the market, I think you need to evaluate the institutional environment. This is something that needs to be done. Without this evaluation, the assessment, everything will just stop, and that won't be profitable. As for PPP market trends, international best practices sort of show us the following. Over the past 7 years that we've been in existence, trade and logistics complexes, I think, is something we need to pay attention to. Everyone is building trade and logistics hubs and centers. Old retail, sort of old markets are now being turned into and upgraded into newer ones. We have this Chinese border, and so this is a trend for Kyrgyzstan. Do you have more of these projects? Yes. Yes, the number of these projects is steadily growing, and I've told you about Talas and the Talas region. I think points of sale, as we call them, constitute this trend that we're observing in Kyrgyzstan. Thank you. I'm very grateful to you. Hopefully our audience are also grateful to you. But let's conclude our session now. And how can EDB be useful for strengthening this maturity? So we now made this conclusion that PPP as an idea is great, but it needs to be turned into a bankable project with proper calculations, which is clear to investors and which is safe for the government.
So we are following upstream preparation model, where there is a foundation which starts with the zero stage for the successful PPP building and includes assessment, prioritization of the idea, whether this is in line with the infrastructure plans, with development strategies in certain sectors. Then we do value for money, but we are not dependent on any particular country regulatory issues. And the same zero level, we study the regulatory issue to understand whether there are mechanisms to launch this project or not. Are there any problems which may prevent them? Legislation is then adopted in its early sound market. First of all, analyzing the demand of the market, analyzing the competitors and risks, and after that, discussing the project idea with the government, if necessary, creating cooperative mechanisms and preparing the project teams in the state owner. Might be the same industry like waste management or education. And only after that, structuring the main parameters. So it could be the feasibility study or the concept, the preparation, the proposal for implementation, private initiatives. Let me share two examples from an idea to project, from a project to funding, which we have in upstream preparation. It's a Kant, Uzbekistan project where the waste is generating income because it's not buried at the site, but they're being processed for the RDF, fuel, VMR, technical soil, which would become the source of private partners. It's an extremely difficult project. It requires special legal and institutional conditions to be set. But this is not the only project, it's not the pinpoint for Kyrgyzstan and for many other countries. The waste management is a big problem, and our project could be downskilling others. The other idea, developing transboundary flows through both sides of the wire. So we are not sure whether the PPP will show more comparative advantages. However, this practice is to be implemented in the country. And then we can get the new structure at of these two offices. So both projects, they have the history since we had a meeting on PPP. So we do this throughout our countries. But this is just only one component of our complex program to boost the Central Asia. And so we have a FIA reward and recognition. We implement this gradually, but in a relative way. So like a country profile based on Armenia, we've received the request on establishing in the government a PPP center. We financed the single достуp to PPP in electronic government. I like to thank them. The PPP training and seminars, because investors are not looking at slides. They are looking at the employers who are going to conduct the product so more than 450 participants could increase their competences in Belarus, in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. And we see a bit in the future. And right now we help to create HR for the PPP, because our scholarship program supports talented students that are passionate about PPP. And so that means that PPP is going to develop in Eurasia, and the full potential would be unlocked by those young guys that are already from the early start, they would understand everything. I'd like to thank all the speakers, and this is the end of our session, and I invite you all to the communication of PPP booth, where you can learn even more from the bank, from the representatives of the agencies in PPP and PPP centers. Thank you so much. The session is exhausted. We thank all the speakers and participants. Dear guests and participants, at 13:30 in Brasserie there will be a final cocktail. So we invite you to continue networking